Everyone, welcome everyone. We'll get started in a minute.
Yep, we'll let everyone get populated into the room. Thank you for coming. We have a couple more that are just trying to get in. This is almost like watching people walk in the room. Fantastic. Welcome everyone to our last seminar of the semester, part of our seminar series that we run. I would like to let you all know that we are recording this so that we can place it onto our website after today. We'll get that onto our seminar webpage. I'd also like to thank everyone for joining us. We have students, faculty, and staff. We'd like to welcome Dr. Wesley Marshall. He actually got his PhD from the University of Connecticut, and he is going to talk to us about the future of transportation. The future of transportation isn't what you think it is. So if you'll all join us, we want to let everyone know that we are going to pull questions. If you'd like to go ahead and put them in chat, we'll go ahead and address those at the end of the talk. And so just so you don't forget them, go ahead and put them in the chat, or just we'll raise hands. We'll have time at the end for questions.
All right, thank you for that, Tammy, and thanks, Doug, for inviting me. So welcome again. I'm Wes Marshall. I'm a professor of civil engineering here at the University of Colorado, Denver. Thank you all for taking the time to join me this morning, even though I'm sure you're probably as sick of Zoom meetings as I am. Nevertheless, I wanted to talk to you about the future of transportation today. So let's start with our current transportation problems. So I think if you ask most transportation engineers to talk about our current situation, they'll probably start with something like this, talking about our crumbling infrastructure in bridges, our failing transit systems. This right here was surprising to me because I've actually heard that there's still infrastructure in place along the Northeast Amtrak corridor that was built when Abraham Lincoln was president that we're still using, but we got to be on this one. Related to infrastructure crisis is that we're being, choked by traffic congestion. In fact, solving traffic congestion is inevitably always listed one of the key national transportation priorities. Other transportation related issues, air quality is a big one, which is something that has a direct impact on health. So here is some data from Delhi, and the PM level, particulate level matter, was like a 969, and 25 is considered unsafe. And as you can see here, this is equivalent to smoking, a few dozen cigarettes per day. And these aren't just long-term health problems. Many of these are immediate, things like asthma. And don't think for a second that these problems are half a world away. This is the refinery up in Commerce City. I'm not sure what this orange plume is, but I don't think I'd want to live or work too close to that. And here's a list of cities that had the worst air quality in the world. I think this was from August 7th of last summer, and Denver was the worst in the world on that day. But when it comes to transportation and public health, I think we always seem to gloss over road safety. But as we all know, dying on the roads is not good for your health. I mean, last year, 36,000 people died, which means on average, we're killing 125 people per day. And I can give you all sorts of shocking statistics on road safety, like this one. More Americans have died on the roads since 9/11 than in both world wars combined. Or that more people around the world die every day than died in the 9/11 attacks. But we usually treat these road safety deaths like the cost of doing business instead of the public health issue that it is. We also don't pay too much attention to the fact that we're building places like this, surrounded by roads like this, which, there's a bike lane here. But these things relate to numbers you see with data from the CDC on obesity. Here's the adult obesity rate from 1990 through now. And Colorado always proves to be the best. But if you look closely here, you see that our current rate of around 24%, is almost 9 percentage points worse than the worst state was in 1990. And now the worst states are looking at upwards of 40% of adults being obese. And obviously transportation isn't the only thing behind these numbers, or the diabetes numbers, but the way that we conventionally build our transportation systems isn't helping the cause. And the impacts don't stop at health. It's cost us money as well. Compared to patients classified as normal weight, those classified as obese or severely obese spend a lot more money on healthcare respectively. And it's also beginning to impact kids as well. If you look at Colorado's data, we're in the middle of the pack on this one. So we have all these problems. How are transportation engineers going to fix it? There are two magic elixirs you always hear about. One is technology, and I'll get back to that one in a few minutes. The second is money. Transportation engineers love to say that if you give us enough money, we can fix all your problems. We also love to tell you if you don't give us that money now, it's going to cost you a whole lot more money later. You know, for example, here are some dollar figures putting numbers to traffic congestion. So what you see here is, you know, it's going to cost New Yorkers around $11 billion per year when they sit in traffic, or Bostonians $4 billion per year, so on and so forth. And we add this up for everybody in the country. And you look at it over a 10 or a 20-year time horizon, and you end up talking about trillions of dollars of just time wasted in traffic. And this basic number insinuates that spending any amount of money up to that $2.8 trillion threshold, if we can solve traffic congestion, would be a good investment. And what happens if you only give us 1 trillion instead of 2? Well, it's your loss, because it's going to lead to, you know, traffic Armageddon, job losses, trade losses, consumer spending is going to fall. So will GDP. The list goes on and on. So historically, how did traffic engineers solve this? Oftentimes it's meant tearing up our cities with the promise that these new freeways would solve all our traffic congestion problems. But guess what? That's not exactly how traffic congestion works. And the traffic engineering models told us again and again that we just had to keep building bigger and bigger freeways. Because if we don't, we're going to end up with, at least in this Boston example, they told us at the time, we're going to end up with 20 hours of bumper to bumper traffic each and every day. And that's going to cost us billions more in delays and wasted fuel, so on and so forth. It all sounds very scary. And it makes for a really good argument if I'm trying to talk you into giving us money. You know, I used to think we were a little bit misguided in the way that we extrapolated these trends. So you see here, the green represents actual vehicle miles traveled, and the maroon dash line is what the official federal government projection from that year went on into the next 20 years there. But let me show you what happens as things shifted. So you can see here, the green keeps representing what's actually happening, and the red is what the government kept projecting was going to happen after. So seeing this, you know, sort of makes you wonder what the hell we're doing. And the deeper I dug on the methods and sort of stuff that goes into this, the more I realized how unscientific it was. It was almost like a pseudoscience that these traffic engineering models are inevitably predicting more and more traffic. But I think the bigger issue isn't the models themselves, it's the fact that we treat these extrapolated trends as if it's something we just have to accommodate. In Colorado's traffic models are no different. So for instance, here's CDOT wrote this response to, you know, one of the groups I was trying to get some other ideas, you know, to look at how I-70 could happen in Denver. And CDOT said the same thing. Like, if CDOT doesn't do anything, this problem's going to get a lot worse. It's going to take 65 minutes to go 12 miles. And that's from like Peoria to maybe I-25 or so. And wow, I mean, that sounds pretty bad, but it's based on similar extrapolations, assuming that everyone is simply going to be doing what they're doing now, as if driving is inevitable, as if people sitting in traffic for 2 hours a day wouldn't ever think to maybe do something different, like maybe take the train or bike to work like I did today, or maybe even move closer to where they need to go. Instead, I mean, CDOT did what they were always going to do. And the former head of CDOT actually admitted to me that we never should have built I-70 through the heart of Denver to begin with. But his point was it was too late. Like, we had to just go and expand it. So what we're getting is around 188 feet wide of freeway. If you include those frontage roads on each side, it's as wide as a football field is long. And we forget that people live here or go to school here or church here, like literally in the shadow of our highways. So I think here's why I'm not exactly enamored with the idea that we can just solve our problems with money. Because I think we're asking the wrong questions. Eliminating traffic congestion isn't really the goal. Every semester when I teach my sustainable transportation course, one of the first things I ask the students is, what is transportation for? Inevitably, they always give me some version of moving goods and people from A to B. It sounds good, and it's what you read if you look it up on the internet, but it sort of misses the point. Transportation is really about connecting people with opportunities, such as jobs, or social opportunities, or recreational opportunities. So if we ask how to reduce congestion, our subset of answers tends to focus on adding more lanes to freeways. If we instead ask how to improve access to those opportunities, then our subset of answers gets a whole lot more interesting. There's a great quote from this Lewis Mumford book from early 60s, and it speaks to the idea that A and B, like where you start and where you end, aren't necessarily set in stone. So in other words, I think a good transportation system can provide more access with less mobility. But for the last 100 years, traffic engineers have focused on just improving mobility and not thinking about access being the issue. So let's look at an example like to show my students as well. This is what Detroit used to look like. And this is a much more recent picture of downtown Detroit, where I-75 runs right through downtown. And this is what Berlin, Germany used to look like. And this is what Berlin, Germany looks like now. And the question I asked my students is, based on these pictures, who would you think won the war? Detroit focused on reducing traffic congestion, and they did it so well that they nearly killed off Detroit. Berlin went in a different direction and is much better off for doing so. And despite the fact that reducing traffic congestion really is never the goal of transportation, the new transportation bill is dedicating billions each and every year to that misguided goal. So beyond dollars, the other panacea we always hear about is technology. Before I talk about our autonomous future, I want to talk a little bit about Uber and Lyft, because I see these companies a little bit as recent examples of people thinking that smartphones, at the time, an already available technology, could solve a lot of our problems. So this article dates back to 2013, and in it, one of the co-founders of Lyft talked about one of the most underutilized resources in transportation were the empty seats in our car. And I heard him say the same thing at a conference I went to in LA. And you can see similar quotes from this one from the Deloitte Center saying pretty much the same thing, that this is an underutilized resource, and this makes sense. And the title of their article is Smart Mobility, Reducing Congestion and Fostering Faster, Greener, and Cheaper Transportation Options. And when it came to Uber and Lyft, I mean, that was the thinking, that they could save the world, save us money, and get rid of traffic congestion. So this is why one of my former PhD students and I, Alejandro, we decided to try to research Uber and Lyft. And because these companies aren't exactly known as good sharers, we had to go collect our own data. So that meant Alejandro had to go drive for them for a few months. What do we learn? Well, when we include the driving done without a passenger, or what we call deadheading, along with what the passengers would have done had Uber and Lyft not existed in the first place, we ended up with more than 80% more vehicle miles traveled. So what we found, the problem isn't all the empty seats in all the cars, it was really the cars. On a related note, we also looked at how much money Alejandro made while working for him. On the surface, it seemed like he made $16 an hour. When you account for expenses, it was well less than minimum wage. But still, the fact that these companies had to pay their drivers turned out to be one of the biggest hurdles to profitability. In fact, neither of these companies are profitable even today. So they've long been excited about the prospects of autonomous vehicles. Like, here's what Lyft said back in 2016 about their timeline for autonomous vehicles. In fact, here's a quote from that article. So this is in 2016. They said the majority of Lyft rides within 5 years will be autonomous. In a similar piece on Medium, the co-founder of Lyft wrote this: by 2025, private car ownership will all but be over in major US cities. Given that we're well into 2022, this isn't looking so good. Now, I don't want to just pick on Lyft, but they were just sort of the easiest to find some interesting quotes from. But that was the prevailing sentiment at the time. Like, here's somebody, a top Silicon Valley investor, saying that in 2 years, our highways will be fully autonomous. And he said this back in 2016 as well. And the funny thing is, if you read transportation, for another project, I've been digging into a lot of old transportation literature. If you read stuff from the 40s and 50s, they saw the 1970s as this technological car utopia. If you read articles from the 70s, they saw the 90s as this time when traffic would be gone from our highways because we've made it so far with cars. And that's the dream. It's still the dream today that, you pull out your phone and this car with nobody in it will pull up and pull you away. Not only will it solve traffic congestion, but it's going to solve road safety. It's going to solve air pollution. We're going to be able to get rid of our parking spaces, our street signs. It's going to give us more rooms for parks, more room for sidewalks. I even found this kid's children book about this autonomous future of ours. And we can convert our parking garages into these amazing sort of mixed use buildings and reminisce back to the time when cars actually had to park there. Why don't we need parking? Well, the autonomous cars will be busy cleaning the streets, watering our plants, and this one is changing light bulbs. I'm not sure how that's all going to happen, but here's my point. It's not that simple. So back when I was on sabbatical in Australia, they used to have this seminar series like once a month called City Talks. And one of the speakers was Carlo Ratti from MIT. He's with the Sensible City Lab. And they do a lot of great work and it looks awesome. And here's a video we showed to a packed house of people. And what you're seeing here is a micro simulation of a regular intersection compared against an autonomous intersection. With the autonomous intersection, all the cars are basically getting reservations in real time. Then they finagle their way through the intersection with complete knowledge of where every other car is. And he called this the future of urbanism and proceeded to get a standing ovation. And I was sitting there wondering, like, where the hell does a pedestrian go in this sort of urban paradise? And how this doesn't work if you have a single human driver. And that is the sort of problem that I think we underestimate when we talk about autonomous cars as the panacea, because most of the benefits of autonomy only come to fruition when the entire system is autonomous. And guess what? People love their cars. There's a reason why there's 10 or 11 Fast and the Furious movies. There's a reason why they made $6 billion at the global box office. And why much of what you see in those movies is a little bit far-fetched. The fundamentals of car culture are everywhere. I mean, do you really think this person is going to want to drive an autonomous vehicle? Or the guy that drives this truck, which I forced my son to stand in front of for reference when I took this picture. Or somebody that drives a car like this, or this crazy lady. So, while driving is not exactly a constitutionally protected right, I think it could mirror the gun debate. Like, you're going to pull this steering wheel out of my cold, dead hands. Another issue with adding technology is what we call risk compensation. So risk compensation refers to the idea that people typically adjust their behavior in response to the perceived levels of risk. So they become more careful when they sense greater risk and less careful if they feel more protected. It's also why, like the highway you see here, which is perfectly engineered, according to all of our guidebooks, actually has a far worse safety record than the seemingly treacherous road going up Mount Evans, which is now called Mount Blue Sky, that you see here. Because you drive very differently on this road with two hands clutched around the steering wheel than you do on this first one. Or when my son was little, we'd put a helmet on him and he would bike like a maniac, like he thought he was a Marvel superhero. Take the helmet off and he would bike like a normal person. So, which is safer? If he didn't change his behavior, then it's easy to say the helmet's going to help. But if people behave differently, it's not so simple. And for example, most new cars now have these sensors that tell you when there's an adjacent car in your lane if you're trying to change lanes on the highway. It should totally make us safer, right? But let me tell you a quick story. So it's maybe 10 years ago. I was driving up to the mountains with a neighbor of mine, and he had a new BMW at the time, and this was the new technology that was on it. So he kept changing lanes without looking. And as the passenger, it was a little bit disconcerting. So anyways, he told me about this lane change assist technology he had, and his thinking was that he didn't have to look at all. The car was simply going to warn him if it was safe to change lanes. And if he behaved in a way where he added this technology on top of what he normally did, which would maybe use a mirror and look over shoulder, then yes, it would probably make it safer. But is it safer when we replace what we normally do? Maybe, but maybe not. The same goes for other technologies. So the brake assist technologies that a lot of cars have now. So if we added this tech to our existing behaviors, it would undoubtedly help. But if we start thinking that maybe we can look at our cell phone for a few seconds longer, better safety may no longer be the case. And I was looking at a recent paper about this technology, and it found that the chance of it seeing a pedestrian and stopping for that pedestrian was only slightly better than a coin flip. And guess what? The odds drop at night, and the odds actually drop when that pedestrian has darker skin. But they don't tell you that when you buy these cars. 5 years ago, when I was again on sabbatical in Australia, we rented this car that it felt almost like a video game when you're trying to park. This pop-up display would show up. And so not only did you get the real camera, but you had this sort of overhead plan view. So parking the car felt more like a video game than reality. But guess what? Like when it rained, it was barely usable. Here's a quick clip from it's from an SNL episode last fall. Hopefully the audio works here.
Officials with Waymo, a self-driving taxi service, say that after a year, the robotoxic taxis still have trouble with left turns and puddles, which explains Waymo's slogan, "Let's get in Waymo accidents."
So I'm not going to delve into the left turn issue today. It's a whole other can of worms. But if they can't handle puddles, what are the chances they can deal with snow? Here's another example from Waymo that speaks to the risk compensation idea. Back in 2013, when Google felt like they were seriously making some headway with their autonomous cars, they actually let employees sign up to take one out for the weekend. But they didn't tell the employees that they had set cameras up all over the place in the cars. They told their employees that these were not fully autonomous. You had to be ready to take over at a moment's notice at any time. It's sort of technology that's not quite there. And what did they find when they did it? Well, not quite this, but they found that people were doing everything but paying attention to the road. They were napping. They were like reaching to the back seat, not looking around. Why? Well, one thing we know for sure, humans aren't that good at paying close attention to things that rarely need their attention. And this is why it wasn't that surprising to see what happened with this. This is Elaine Herzberg. She was the first pedestrian death from an autonomous vehicle. And the operator, who was supposed to, again, be ready to take over at a moment's notice, instead of looking at the road, they were watching the voice on their cell phone. We saw this because there was cameras inside and outside showing everything that happened. So if you dig deeper into what happened, Uber, the car actually saw Elaine and deemed her to be a false positive. And reason being, they designed it that way. The road ride was too bumpy because it was getting too many false positives. So they told the technology to ignore it. The alternative would be designing our autonomous cars to actually stop for pedestrians, which is what you would assume we would do. But if that's the case, then I could close my eyes and walk out into the street like Moses and part the Red Sea. Or you might get, teenagers bullying cars. So it's not that surprising for people to cut corners when it comes to safety in their attempt for autonomy. And there was this great New York Times article talking about all the people that Tesla has killed with their autopilot, which they call autopilot, but it isn't really that. There's actually a documentary that I just heard about yesterday that's going to be coming out next month on Hulu if you want to watch about that. So, we have all these questions. We haven't even talked about a lot of the important policy decisions that would need to be made. For one, will these be a shared resource, or will we continue the sort of private personal ownership model? Either way, I guess, can I get dropped off at work? If it's a shared one, I can get dropped off at work and my car could go work for others. If it's not, would I park my autonomous car all day, or would it be able to drive around without passengers? Could I send it home for the day and not have to pay for parking downtown? Or, maybe while I give this presentation, it could just circle the block for an hour. Or could I send a dog for a ride like this Tesla owner was apparently doing very recently? Which reminded me of Back to the Future, albeit that was a remote controlled DeLorean. So yes, like with a lot of these technologies, we're not reducing the need for oil, and it might make it easier and cheaper to drive. But when we make things cheaper and easier to do, guess what? We get more of it. So our autonomous future could in fact lead to an exponential increase in vehicle miles traveled and an exponential increase in congestion. So we may end up with a future that isn't that different from the present. Like even flying cars might not help. So, just like cities had traffic congestion before cars were invented, we might also see it if cars could fly. At one point during the pandemic, my kids, I guess, got super bored and wanted to watch the Jetsons. And this image is from the first episode where George is trying to get to work. And we still haven't even talked about the potential for hackers and security issues, or just the general idiocy of delivering a 2-pound pizza with a 2-ton car. Or even reliability. I mean, how often does your cell phone work exactly right as fast as you want it to? So I wouldn't quite go this far as this headline you see here, but the exact same news outlets that were trumpeting our driverless future a few years ago have declared that it's officially dead. So I'm going to talk about some historical precedents and what we can learn from that shortly. But before I get to that, I want to tell you about a trip I took up to Golden last winter to test out their autonomous mines rover. It was run by a company called Avco, and the student operators are on there, and they're paid through student fees at School of Mines. And it's a shuttle that has a few loops around campus, and it ran something like 7:30 to 4:30 every day, Monday through Friday. And the shuttles are designed to stop every 5 or 10 minutes. And I was there for an article that I think it was called The Voice of America was doing. It's apparently like a BBC-like news outlet. It's broadcast all around the world except for the United States, which is kind of weird. Anyways, these shuttles are pretty cool. Their max speed is around 12, but usually they're going around 7 or 8. So you could definitely bike faster, if not walk faster than them. But because they're so slow, it frustrates people. So here's one taking a normal left turn. And what you'll see is 2 cars cut the corner because it's just going so slow. So they take an inside, there aren't 2 lanes there, but they take an inside route around that autonomous car that's just taking a left turn. Here's an example of a vehicle refusing to accept a gap in traffic that most humans would easily accept. Again, cars start to pass it, even though it's the first in line at a stop sign. Eventually, this leads to a 3-minute impasse with a truck. So I can kind of flip through it here. This video goes on and on. This truck stops here and tries to let this autonomous vehicle go straight, but it refuses to. And the video goes on and on and on and on. And nobody moves, and cars keep going around it and around it. Finally, you see it go after 3 minutes and 20 seconds. During my ride, the AVU's computer system also literally crashed, and here you can see that sad face popped up on the interface that they had there, and we all to get out while the operator literally had to reboot it like my laptop. Yet here, technology people basically say that autonomous driving is a solved problem. Eventually, their ridership declined to less than 100 per day, and they had to close up shop about 6 months early. All right, so let's slow down for a second and talk about what I think we can learn from the past, because back in the early 1900s, cars were thought of as the environmentally friendly solution. Like that was our technological panacea. It would solve problems like the dead horses and the manure in the cities. It was going to solve all the traffic congestion problems we were having. So what do? Like we went about trying to rebuild our cities to accommodate this new technology. You might have heard of the Futurama exhibit from the 1939 World's Fair in New York. This is where Norman Bel Geddes presented his vision for the future of cities. A couple of years prior, he did a similar thing for Shell gasoline. If you look at some of the text, it gave a bit more context for what he was thinking. And his thinking was, given this new technology of cars and give him a bunch of money, he thought we could eliminate traffic congestion by 1960. How are we going to do that? We're going to remove sidewalks, remove on-street parking from our cities, and turn our streets into freeways. Did it work? Cities like Atlanta kind of tried it. When I was there, I guess it was more than a few years ago now. I was amazed I could walk nearly several city blocks in these gerbil tubes without ever setting foot on the street. And these sort of things kill street life. So does this. Combine that with an extensive system of freeways and interchanges, they did exactly what we thought was going to solve congestion. And guess what? You end up with more traffic congestion than almost any city in the world. And we did similar things to a lot of our cities. Here's Chicago, Milwaukee, Los Angeles. This is another one from Orange County, California. And this one, I showed you I-70, which is 1 football field wide. This one is 2. This is around 260 yards wide. And now we have cities from all over the world trying to follow our lead. So if we don't think more about this, we could end up like this. And really, it's not all that different than a lot of what our cities are starting to look like now. So what have we learned from our past? I'm not sure. Like Futurama was going up. The Boring Company, this is Elon Musk's, I guess, 3rd or 4th company in his repertoire here, is trying to go down. Like the idea is to have these elevators bring cars down to an underground car-sized tunnels where they can then crisscross our city at high speeds. But to me, this is basically like a Stranger Things version of Futurama. And what's the difference really? Like it runs into a lot of the same fundamental problems that going up did. And here's what he actually tweeted a couple of days ago. He's trying to solve traffic. And if your goal is to solve traffic, then I think you're missing the point of transportation. So yes, our technological future might include a few high-tech things like the Hyperloop, but I always have a hard time thinking we're going to build a massive system of autonomous intersections and tunnels and Hyperloop train tubes. We can't even get our damn sidewalks right. Here's a 2-foot sidewalk with a rolled curb on a major street in Denver. And streets like this, you can't even fit 2 people next to each other. But now I'm being told by, this is a tweet from the Utah DOT, basically saying that it's dangerous for pedestrians to walk side by side. They should be walking in single file. If that's the case, we're doing something wrong. And here's a picture I took. This is, I think, about 2 miles from campus. This one leads to the Alameda train light rail station. And this is a light rail station we invested billions of dollars into. And images like this, these are all from Denver, and I probably have 50 more I could show you. They should be embarrassing to a major US city. Because when we don't provide the fundamental infrastructure to help people walk and bike and those sort of things, we force people into dangerous situations. Here's a wheelchair user that has to be in the middle of the street because they can't fit onto the narrow sidewalk. And I see this time and time again. And some of those were actually great sidewalks compared to many of those that are completely missing. Or like this that lead to nowhere. So it's not exactly rocket science why walking becomes like a mode of last resort for most people, or why we aren't getting the transit ridership numbers that we want when we can't be bothered to put a sidewalk next to a bus stop. And at least here we have a sidewalk, but this is a transit stop on Colfax where I think 22,000 people per day use a bus on this street. But this is still better than a lot of what I see around Denver, where they're just non-existent. I have this great book on my shelf here about Soviet era bus stops, and they're dotted all over Europe. Apparently it was one of the few places where the Soviet Union let their artists sort of run wild. So they ended up with these amazing bus stops, many of which are in the middle of nowhere. And compare that to this picture I took of a woman waiting for a bus in the Globeville neighborhood. This is less than a mile from where I am right now. So a mile from downtown Denver. And it's easy for us to forget that real people use these places. But I think when you see a picture like that, you begin to realize it. So my thinking is that we can do better. How do we do so? Instead of adapting our cities to whatever we think the next new technology is, I think we need to make those technologies adapt to our cities. To be honest, I'm not that impressed with technology behind like a new electric Hummer. It weighs 9,000 pounds. It can go from 0 to 60 in 3 seconds and costs $100 grand. I'd rather have technology that can tell this traffic signal that this guy needs a few more seconds to cross the street. Or maybe some technology that can help us keep track of where our sidewalks are in the first place. Because one of my recent master students, Peyton Gibson, we ended up interviewing 16 cities, and we asked them what data they collect for roadways and how they use that data. And every city collected amazing road data on a regular basis, and they analyzed the data in these amazing software packages. If there was a pothole, they'd be able to fix it in a day or two. We then asked the exact same questions for sidewalks. And almost every time we heard, well, it's complicated. What we found out is that most of these cities have no idea where their sidewalks are or where to even start in terms of collecting their data. And it's not that they can't do it. Soon I got here, as Tammy said, back in 2009, I found this sidewalk GIS layer on the city's website. And interestingly, it was data from like 03 or 04. And every other data set on their website was being updated on a regular basis. And this one wasn't for some reason. So when I asked somebody why that's the case, I was told that the city's lawyers told them that they couldn't, because if they knew there was a problem, they'd be liable. So what do? Like an ostrich, they stuck their head in the sand. But that didn't work. Cities got sued over these issues, and they continue to. And I think cities are now beginning to realize that pretending to not know where there's a problem is not going to work. At the same time, many regions started to collect what we call planimetric data based on high resolution imagery. A lot of these cities are not collecting it for what I want to do with it. Instead, they're using it so they can bill homeowners for how much impervious area they have. Here's an actual bill I got in the mail not long ago. But this data could also be used to quantify sidewalks. So regardless of the underlying intent, this was an opportunity. And it's not just about sidewalks. We also, I think, need to recognize that we litter them with obstacles to the point where this woman decided that it's better to use a wheelchair on the bike lane than on the sidewalk. So if we can build a good sidewalk here, this is up in the Finger Lakes, we should be able to build one anywhere, but we don't. We end up with examples like this or this. From my perspective, if a kid doesn't have enough room for a lemonade stand, we're doing something wrong. So here's a picture where I forced my wife out to go buy some warm lemonade so I could take a picture of this kid trying to sell lemonade on a very narrow sidewalk. So anyways, what can we learn from all this? What is the real future transportation? In reality, I think the real future transportation, the real future of sustainable transportation is not all that different than it was 20 or 200 years ago. The future of sustainable transportation is always going to come back to the fundamentals of walking and biking. There is a reason why our simplest streets and our simplest street patterns have worked for thousands of years. Most of the places we love most in our cities would be illegal to build today. Like this is Acorn Street. It's in Beacon Hill neighborhood of Boston. It's apparently one of the most photographed streets in America, and it's only 6 feet wide from curb to curb. Has some of the highest property values in America as well. And at the time, the standard was you had to have 2 cows pass each other here. But this street is illegal, but this one is not. Nor is this. And, if these people get killed crossing the street, we blame them entirely. It's their fault for jaywalking. We never stop to wonder why they did so. Even if, the nearest crosswalk could be 2 miles away. And it could be a terrible crosswalk, and there could be non-existent sidewalks between here and there. We'll put the onus on them. It's not just about streets. Our street networks, I think, matter much more than people realize or give them credit for. Like here is one built well before traffic engineering ever existed. This is Savannah in 1733. And it continues to function really well today. But we redesign our cities and suburbs to suit that new technology at the time, which was the automobile. So I grew up in Watertown, Massachusetts. It was a town founded around 1630. It's a typical organic grid, compact. As a kid, I could walk or bike all over town. And after I went off to University of Virginia for undergrad, I came back and I worked at Sasaki Associates there. And around that time, a lot of my coworkers were sort of moving out to suburbs like Chelmsford. They were a little bit older, so they were getting married, kids. And they had these sparse or disconnected networks. And their idea was they could get away from the traffic congestion, and they thought these areas were safer. So when it came time for my dissertation, I wondered if some of those things were actually true. It turns out it wasn't. To be fair, you're probably safer if you never actually leave your cul-de-sac, but the tree-like networks that you see sort of up here are usually supported by these big large arterial roads. And those places are killing far more people than the gridded networks. Like, yes, the gridded networks have a few more fender benders, like 9% more fender benders, but 27% fewer fatalities. They are safer. And if we treated road safety like a health impact, instead of just counting how many crashes happen, then you see that. And these more compact and connected networks also tend to be the sort of places where people tend to walk and bike more often. And this means also much less driving as well, and far less vehicle miles traveled. So we did a few studies on this, and here you see that adults living in the gridded networks, they drive about 19.2 miles per person per day, down on the bottom right there, and the ones in this Tree Lake ones travel around 22.7 miles per person per day. So those numbers may not sound like much, but in a city like Denver, we have like 700,000 people. Just one additional mile per person per day adds up to something like 250 million extra miles driven each year. Since people were walking and biking more, I sort of asked the obvious question as to whether there are differences in actual health outcomes. And this data was a bear to get, but once we did, we sort of realized that it was true as well. The findings were significant. There were far lower rates of obesity and high blood pressure and heart disease. But as much as we, I think, hate to admit it, transportation and health go hand in hand. And this is a real picture, by the way, from San Diego. When I showed this to my students a couple of years ago, one of my students, his sister happened to be living in San Diego at the time, and she sent me an updated photo of what they've done since then. But, you know, this also relates to one of my more recent papers where I was trying to sort of disentangle why cities with a lot of bicycling tend to be safer for everybody. This fact in transportation is pretty counterintuitive for traffic engineers, because the numbers suggest that bicycling, like a mile bicycling versus a mile in a car, is way more dangerous on a bike. Thus, you would think a city with a lot of bicycling would be more dangerous. On the other hand, a city with a lot of transit, like we know a mile on a bus or a train is safer than driving. So a city with a lot of transit should be safer, and that's true. But it's also true that cities with a lot of bicycling are some of our safest cities. Like a city like Boulder, which should be less safe, isn't, but it's not the case whatsoever. So a lot of these things that we do to make walking and biking better, it turns out to make it safer for everyone involved. And a lot of people would attribute some of those safety benefits to things like safety numbers, but my results show that it was more than the bicyclists on the road. It was much more important the infrastructure that we built for them. So improving the bike infrastructure, especially with things like protected and separated bike facilities, was associated with the fewest fatalities and the best overall road safety outcomes, and not just for bicyclists, but for everybody. In contrast that to the bicycle environment we see in most cities. I took this picture recently. I was out in Aurora, and this car is coming around this corner like at 50 miles an hour, and there's a kid on a bike on a 2-foot sidewalk. And you know why I love seeing protected bike lanes? It doesn't matter if they don't provide real protection. So letting people park in a bike lane or place a dumpster there forces people back into traffic, and that happens all the time out here. It's not a big deal when it happens to me, but it's not okay when it happens to a kid, because we've ended up in a place where like this is the safest place for a kid to ride a bike. And if this is the case, again, we're doing something wrong. It doesn't help when we can't even be bothered to lower the speed limit in a school zone below 40 miles an hour. Like this is on Federal Boulevard near a elementary school. And this is one on Leesdale. And this is right near where a student got killed. But, you know, we blame it on the driver for infringing on her crosswalk instead of traffic engineers for designing a place where it entices people to behave that way. So, you know, by no means am I a Luddite or anti-technology. The future is definitely going to have high-tech solutions. And if you've seen that movie Black Panther, Wakanda had these really cool looking high-speed maglev lines. And I think we need to keep in mind that solutions like this are only going to work in the right context. They can't replace the good urbanism that makes cities great places to be in the first place. And I think the people of Wakanda knew that because they had this really slow moving transit in this very walkable urban marketplace. And that's the real future of transportation, and that's what we need to be planning for. Technology can help us enhance that. For instance, by sensing the elderly person in the crosswalk and automatically adjusting the walk signal. But it can't replace the fundamentals of what cities do well. If not, then I think what's going to happen is we're going to continue to exacerbate an unsustainable trend. I made this graph to show that over the last 100 years or so, vehicle miles traveled has increased 24-fold, while population has increased only 2.5-fold. So if you think about what our futuristic smart cities are going to look like, I think we need to take a lesson from 100 years ago when they were planning for these amazing new places based on what was the new technology at the time, which was the car. And we need to keep in mind that the cities that went all in on redesigning themselves for that new technology are the ones that are the worst off now. So what we need to do instead is focus on the fundamentals of transportation, making things like walking, biking, and transit, building that infrastructure and making it for everybody, including kids. And if people can do those things safely first, then we're heading in the right direction. Because we need to also ask ourselves the right questions with regard to what transportation is for, instead of asking how to solve congestion. And if we invest in that together, I think we'll put ourselves on a much better path. All right, thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Wes. Really compelling and interesting discussion. It's definitely the most slides that we've had in seminar ever. So
Not surprised.
yeah. Let me ask, it's probably a completely unfair question, but you kind of at the start, you were talking a little bit about, kind of the net cost versus the net gains of different things. Have you ever tried to back of the envelope a vision that you have? If you were to make all of these changes, would it be net zero kind of in the cost of making the improvements? Or could you say, if we just did these 5 things and reduce these other 5 things, and when I say the net cost being reduced would be, mortalities and healthcare issues and all of these other kinds of issues. Have you ever been able to kind of wrap your head around, look, if we just did the right thing, it's not going to be super expensive, or is it super expensive?
Actually, we were talking about some of these things last night in my class on safety. Because when we do a cost benefit analysis for like I-70, we put numbers to how much our time is worth. So there's a value of time number, and it's usually around like $15 per hour. And for the number of hours you sit in traffic, they sort of add all that up for the tens of thousands of people that use the highway. And if, the intervention costs less than all that congestion money, then it's worthwhile.
Right.
At the same time, the safety numbers are astronomical. So the last ones we could find, we were talking about this last night, was like $840 billion that we spend overall each year on the costs of road safety issues, fatalities, severe injuries, like all that sort of stuff. But we don't often play the same game. We don't, for whatever reason, we don't do the same sort of cost benefit analysis with those, because we compared it to the annual revenue for every major sports league only came to 52 billion. So the NFL, Major League Baseball, basketball, there's like 20 of them. They came to 52 billion, but road safety for just the US was 840 billion. But we don't play those games. We always can find enough money to expand I-70. For whatever reason, we can almost never find enough money for like a bike lane or a sidewalk. There's sidewalks missing all over Denver, but it's coming from different pots of money. So it would be worthwhile. It should be simple, but for whatever reason, there's a disconnect there. We don't treat them the same, because when we did the numbers, we realized that it would be worth killing a person every day in Denver if we could save everybody in Denver an hour of time each day. And that is a disconnect. Like, we're valuing mobility, one person's mobility over another person's safety. And that's what we're sort of missing. So even if I could do that, we need a different mindset, if that makes sense.
Hi, Wes.
Hi, Marty.
Hi, Wes. Thanks. That was fantastic, as I always enjoy kind of listening to you, and it's so thoughtful and insightful. I have a kind of question. I wonder if you could just kind of comment on, I probably won't express this all that well, but kind of when you talk a lot about, designing the transportation network, the technology of, the vehicles, I guess, in that network, whether they're human walkers, bicyclists, or cars. But the fundamental kind of thing that you started your talk with was the purpose of transportation, right? And it's sort of connecting kind of people, or creating access for kind of people to what they need, whether it's, whether it's work, whether it's culture or whatnot. So the perspective on designing the transportation infrastructure, et cetera, kind of lives in the context of an even bigger system, right? This bigger system of where people live, where they go for culture, where they work, and so forth. And so can you just comment a little bit kind of on, I think, that connection, or how I should think about that connection, and what complexities that brings in to all of the craziness that comes out of some of the decisions that ultimately end up being political in some sense, that go around funding transportation and so forth.
Yeah, I think historically we've sort of we've put them in like different silos. But transportation and land use need to be integrated. Like the way we measure something like road safety, the denominator is always how many miles you travel. So the further you drive, the safer you seem. But it would be a lot safer if your dentist lived, if their office was sort of right on the next block from you. But the way we measure safety, we think, well, if you drive 20 miles to your dentist, for some reason, you're safer than I am, who went down the street to my dentist. So these things, like transportation land use, should be thought of hand in hand. And DRCOG, our regional MPO, is trying to do that. So they have these sort of integrated land use transportation regional planning models, where they look at all the different aspects of what could happen if we have a more compact, dense type land use patterns versus more sprawling. But a lot of our transportation outcomes are related to that. Like if we build places that have accessibility and things like that built in, if they're mixed use and things are closer, that automatically solves a lot of our transportation problems. Instead, if they're thought of separately entirely, one happens in a bubble, and then we're trying to go on top of that by making the roads as big as necessary to sort of fit all the traffic that we think is going to be on it based on those land use patterns. So if we do this together, I think we can sort of solve two things at once.
Thank you.
Tammy, you're on mute.
Dan, I see that you have a question.
Yes, thank you. And thanks, Wes. I enjoyed the talk. I had a question. In healthcare, there's this analysis that shows that 10% of the users might really cost the system a tremendous amount because they're the ones that wait for care, or just are not kind of in tune with health. And is there any similar analysis for drivers or users of transportation? Because sometimes within cities, like the cities will limit zones to like weight and size of vehicles, but there's no limitation that as soon as you get a driver's license at 16, you're allowed to connect to any part of the transportation system. And I'm wondering if there's been any studies that say transportation will work this much more efficient if the drivers had this much skill to them. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure there's that 10% type rule, but I think historically transportation engineers have always sort of focused on trying to find those like bad apples in the system. But at the same time, I think that's a little bit misguided. A lot of times it's sort of what we build for them. I think the corollary, I think, is more that most people don't really have any viable choice but to drive. I'm fortunate to live in a place in Denver where I have the option to bike or take the train to work. But most people live in a place where they don't. So, we did a study a number of years ago, and this is sort of, it's interesting now, given how gas prices have gone up of late. We looked at which places would be better off or worse off if gas prices doubled or tripled overnight. The name of the paper is something like The Shock Around the Suburbs, because a lot of those places, those folks don't have another choice. So even like if you don't use transit every day, the fact that is there has sort of a resiliency value to you. So if your car breaks down, if God forbid you had a DUI or something, you have that option. But most people don't. And a lot of people, cars are very expensive and time consuming, and like there's money that could be spent elsewhere. So I think if we think of cars as freedom, but I think real freedom is more about giving people options. And if we build places that give people those options, that would be more helpful.
Yori,
Thank you.
I see you have a question next.
Yes, hi, thank you. I wanted to ask, I saw how some of your pictures include a lot of examples in some low-income neighborhoods around Colfax, and I've seen a lot of members of those communities speak about how when you bring in that sort of infrastructure, that, bike lanes and better sidewalks and better public spaces, it kind of brings the effects of gentrification. So how can we bring that kind of infrastructure to these areas without those negative effects of gentrification?
I mean, that's where I think we need to, integrate with like the policy school and people like that. Like there are policies we can use to help with that. I was at a conference, I think it was when I-70 was still sort of up for debate what they're going to do. And the gentrification topic came up, and a representative from CDOT said that, well, we can't make it too nice around I-70 because then these neighborhoods would gentrify. And I was like, wait, what? Like we're purposely keeping these neighborhoods kind of crappy so to keep them from gentrifying? It's like that. There has to be another way we can solve that problem. Like purposely keeping streets unsafe isn't if you look at our data, it's a lot of those low-income neighborhoods where fatalities and severe injuries are happening on those big arterials. So there has to be other ways we can protect against things like gentrification without purposely keeping those places unsafe at the same time.
Thank you. Are there any more questions? It looks like Jado.
I think Caroline has a question too, by the way.
I can go after Jado.
I'm double muted. So thank you for great presentation, Wes. I am interested in your autonomous crossroad example. Would it be possible for the infrastructure to talk to cars about information on the road?
Yeah.
In conjunction with the car-to-car communications?
Yeah, no, we're doing a study now where, one of the biggest problems we see for pedestrian crashes are where they're crossing in the crosswalk and we have a car taking a left turn into them. So the person is being told that they can walk. At the same time, we're telling a driver they're permitted to go, but they have to make sure the pedestrian's not there. At the same time, they're looking at 2 lanes of oncoming traffic for a gap. So it's a situation, we sort of have put them in danger with it, but there are ways. We're actually having this discussion last night in class too, about how we could set it up where the car or the crosswalk itself would know there's a pedestrian in the crosswalk and alert either the signal and make it turn red or the driver. Like there are definitely ways to do that for sure. And that's where I think we need to be focusing our technology as opposed to, some of the other stuff where I think we're putting our eggs into those baskets.
So is this something they would consider, to put technologies in the infrastructure?
Yeah, I definitely think so. Like even Denver seems a lot more willing to sort of experiment with things like this. So I do think cities would be really interested.
Okay, all right, thanks.
All right, I'll go. Wes, really well done. A very compelling presentation, and also I loved your focus on people rather than technology. Just sort of an anecdote that I thought that you did a very good job of saying health and children's health. But my own experience, who was an avid bicyclist, bike commuter until I had young kids, one thing your presentation shows is kids who can ride on bikes. But when you have very young kids, you can't take public transportation, you can't bike. And so we need to sort of also build, because you have to get to daycare on a time. And if the bus doesn't run and you have to get there, it just is a whole nother problem. So I just would encourage you to also specifically keep that user group, which is a finite time in people's lives, in perspective, because I think you're absolutely on the right track of looking at the people.
Denver has a new program to subsidize electric cargo bikes, and a lot of folks in my neighborhood are getting their young kids around in electric cargo bikes, and they can put 2-3 kids in these things at a time and get to daycare and get to schools. I think I'm lucky.
My daughter's getting one of those right now. Yeah, they're great. Yeah, they're great.
I think it's not quite true. I mean, a lot of places where people live, yes, you don't have a choice but to drive, but just because you have little kids doesn't mean you can't. I know plenty of people that take their little kids on transit and bikes and that sort of stuff. So I think it is possible, but part of the reason why we can't is a lot of our places make it unsafe.
Marty, I see you have another question.
Well, Wes, I was going to just add on, and you kind of got started down the path I was going to ask you to say something about is kind of talk about walking and biking and so forth, but that technology is changing driving, but it's also changing walking and driving, or walking and riding. And I was curious about, kind of electric bikes and how you think about this in terms of the infrastructure, safety, and, now some of these are almost like, pretty, will move at, 20 or low 20 miles an hour, are big, durable cargo bikes, and are kind of scary when you see them. At the same time, it opens up access to so many people to whom biking was not accessible due to their health or whatnot. So, I mean, I think it's just fascinating, the interplay between technology, kind of human behavior, planning and design, policy, and so forth. But any comments?
Yeah, and I think similar thoughts were had when like the scooters kind of showed up in Denver a few years ago, and people sort of got up in arms how fast they're going and that sort of stuff. And like even now they're geofenced, so when they get to the 60th Street Mall, they can only go 3 miles an hour. And people think we need to do the same thing with bikes. And if you look at the data, I mean, more people get killed by vending machines than by bikes. In big picture, it's the SUVs and like the giant 5, 6, 7,000 pound cars that are if you want to follow the data, those are the ones that are doing the killing. And yes, as there's more electric bikes and they get faster, that might shift and we need to protect against that, but it's not there yet. Like we have plenty of, if you look at the difference between an F-150 now versus 20 years ago, it's twice the size and twice as heavy. Like and that makes it more dangerous. Instead of a pedestrian getting hit and kind of rolling up on the hood of a sedan, like they're now getting hit in the chest, knocked to the ground, their heads hitting the pavement. Like that's more dangerous, but we don't think of that as a liability issue. Like people drive what they drive. If they drove a small car with exterior airbags and bubble wrap on it, pedestrians would be safer, but instead we put bull bars and things like that on our cars. So I think you have to think about all those things in conjunction, and jumping to the bikes already is like, well, we have too many problems to fix first that I think are pressing.
All right, point taken.
Tammy, do we have any more questions?
I have a quick question.
Please.
Yeah, how does public transportation kind of play into this? Like I take the RTD and it's miserable, but I take because I have to. But honestly, if I could, I'd drive to school, because that's just my mentality is I'd rather drive than take that train.
Well, I think for transit, for walking or biking, you sort of have to yeah, a lot of them are focusing on like shaving 1 minute off of train time. Like it'd be much better to make it cleaner or to put free Wi-Fi on them, like things like that. You go to some other countries, like I've spent time in Zurich or like London and Sydney, like their transit is much nicer and everybody uses it because it is much nicer. It is cleaner. It is it feels safer, like personal safety type thing. So, if we want people to use it, we need to, people aren't going to use those things out of the goodness of their environmental heart, or at least most people won't. Like we need to make them better in some tangible ways. And sometimes with things like buses, it's like giving them priority at signals on certain streets, like we're starting to do in downtown, and things like that were unheard of like 10 years ago. And now you're seeing like 2 lanes being given up for those buses. And if those buses become a better option, that's how people will shift. And in your situation, it's unfortunate because your better option would be a car, but it's our job as professionals to make those other things a good, viable option.
Cool. And then just a follow up, as a comp sci student, what's the route I could take to get into this industry?
Come take a transportation course with me. I'm teaching a sustainable transportation course in the fall. It's a good way. It's a good sort of introductory course to a lot of these things. And it is a field. I think a lot of my best students are ones that have come from other disciplines. And I've been reading this book recently sort of about that thinking. And I think it's important. Like we don't just need to have civil engineers become civil professionals. Like we need people coming from all different disciplines. And I think I can bring you into this world. If you want to talk, reach out.
Thank you so much.
I love that answer. Any other questions? We're at the top of the hour. No, we're after the hour. Okay, well, as Tammy said, this is the last seminar of the year. Hopefully we'll have a seminar in the fall. Marty and I are going to be walking through that one over the summer. Thank you so much, Wes. Really, really wonderful talk. I hope everyone has a great summer if I don't see them. Bye-bye.